A tomb sealed for thousands of years, a royal burial untouched by time, and inside, DNA that doesn't belong to any human being ever recorded in scientific history. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't science fiction. This is what researchers actually found, and what they discovered next sent shockwaves through the entire field of human evolution. To understand why this discovery matters so deeply, you have to first understand how rare it is to find anything at all inside an ancient tomb that science can still work with. Bones decay, tissue vanishes. The organic material that makes up a living body breaks down over centuries, over millennia, returning slowly to the soil and the dust from which it came. DNA, the very blueprint of life itself, is perhaps the most fragile of all. It degrades, it fractures into pieces too small to read. It gets contaminated by soil bacteria, by insects, by the hands of every person who has ever touched the remains. When scientists manage to pull any readable genetic material from remains that are thousands of years old, it is already considered a minor miracle. When they pull something they have never seen before, something that doesn't match any entry in any genetic database on the planet, that miracle turns into something else entirely. It turns into a question so large that no single scientist, no single laboratory, no single theory can answer it alone. And that is exactly what happened. The story begins, as so many of the most important stories in archaeology do, not with a dramatic excavation or a headline-grabbing press conference, but quietly. A site, a team, a careful process of extraction and analysis that takes months, sometimes years, before any result worth talking about emerges. Researchers were working with remains found in circumstances that placed them firmly within the category of royal or high-status burials. The physical evidence surrounding the bones, the artifacts, the positioning, the deliberate nature of the burial itself, made it clear that whoever this individual was, they were not ordinary. They were someone who commanded reverence, someone whose death was marked with ceremony, with intention, with a kind of careful preparation that ancient cultures reserved only for their most powerful members. That alone should have made the DNA analysis straightforward, or at least familiar. Royal remains have been studied before. Pharaohs have been sequenced. Medieval kings have had their genomes reconstructed. The bones of emperors and chieftains have given up their secrets to modern laboratories, confirming lineages, revealing health conditions, sometimes overturning long-held historical assumptions. There was every reason to expect that the analysis of these particular remains would follow the same pattern. It would be interesting, perhaps even significant, but ultimately it would fit within the known map of human genetic history. It would confirm something. It would connect to something already understood. It did not. What came back from the laboratory was a genetic signature that did not fit. Not in small ways, not in the subtle, ambiguous ways that leave room for interpretation and debate among specialists. It did not fit in a way that was immediate, striking, and deeply unsettling to the scientists who saw it first. The mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material inherited from the mother's side, the part of the genome most commonly studied in ancient remains because it survives degradation better than nuclear DNA, showed mutations, not the ordinary. Mutations that accumulate slowly across generations and help researchers trace population movements across continents. These were mutations that had never been cataloged, never been seen, not in any human, not in any primate, not in any known animal anywhere in the recorded scientific literature. The researchers did what scientists always do when they see something that seems impossible. They ran the test again, they checked for contamination, they questioned their own methodology. They brought in outside eyes, people with no stake in the result, people whose job was specifically to find the flaw in the reasoning, the error in the process, the mundane explanation that would make the whole thing collapse back into normalcy. And those outside experts looked and checked and scrutinized and came back with the same uncomfortable answer. The data was clean, the methodology was sound. Whatever this was, it was real. Now here is where the story fractures into two very different paths. And understanding both of those paths is essential if you want to grasp what this discovery actually means and why it has generated so much passion, so much debate, and so much controversy in the years since it first emerged. The first path is the one taken by mainstream science. The second path is the one that runs just outside. The boundary of that mainstream, populated by researchers, writers, and theorists who believe the implications of this discovery go far beyond anything the academic establishment is prepared to admit. Let's follow the mainstream path first, because it leads somewhere genuinely extraordinary, even without a single step into speculation. For most of recorded scientific history, the story of human evolution was understood as a relatively clean progression. Early hominins evolved. Species emerged and went extinct. Eventually, Homo sapiens, modern humans, and fire arrived, spread across the globe, and outlasted everyone else. Other human species existed, yes. Neanderthals were the most famous of them. The barrel-chested, heavy-browed cousins who shared Europe with our ancestors for tens of thousands of years before disappearing roughly 40,000 years ago. But the assumption for a long time was that these different human species were essentially separate chapters in a book, one coming after another, with limited overlap and limited interaction. When we got to the chapter about modern humans, the previous chapters were essentially closed. That assumption began to collapse in 2010. That was the year a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology made an announcement that nobody in the scientific world was fully prepared for. They had extracted DNA from a tiny finger bone. The bone was small, fragile, unremarkable in appearance. It had been found in a cave in Siberia called Denisova, and it was estimated to be around 60,000 years old. When the team sequenced the genetic material inside it, they found something that matched neither modern humans nor Neanderthals. It was something else, something that had lived alongside both of those groups, had interbred with them, and had left a genetic legacy that is still carried in the bodies of millions of people alive today. They called this new group the Denisovans, and the discovery turned the entire field of human evolutionary genetics on its head. Suddenly, the story of human evolution was not a clean progression at all. It was a web, a tangle, a messy, overlapping, deeply complicated network of species and subspecies and populations that had been meeting, fighting, trading, mating, and blending across hundreds of thousands of years in ways that nobody had previously imagined. The boundaries between human species were not walls, they were permeable membranes, and the genetic evidence preserved in ancient bones was the only way to see what had actually been happening on the other side of those membranes. This is the world into which the discovery of anomalous DNA in a royal tomb arrived. Not a world of settled science and easy answers, but a world already in the process of radically revising everything it thought it knew about human origins. And that context matters enormously because it means that when scientists found genetic material in those royal remains that matched nothing in their databases, the question they were asking was not simply, is this human? The question was far more specific and far more interesting than that. The question was, which human? Or more precisely, which branch of the vast and tangled human family tree does this belong to? The Denisovan discovery had already established something profound. It had established that there were human populations living and dying and being buried across Eurasia whose genetic signatures were so divergent from our own that they barely resembled us at all, and yet they were human, enough to produce fertile offspring with us. They were human enough to leave a mark in our genome that we carry to this day. They were human and yet deeply, fundamentally different. And there was every reason to believe that the Denisovans were not alone. The ghost populations. That is what geneticists call them. Ancient human groups whose presence can be inferred from the unusual genetic patterns they left behind in the populations they interbred with, but who have never been directly identified, never been given a name, never had a skull or a femur or a finger bone assigned to them. They existed. The math says they existed. But nobody has ever found them. Until possibly now. Because when you look at what the royal tomb DNA analysis actually showed, and you strip away the sensationalism that inevitably attaches itself to discoveries like this one, what you are left with is a set of genetic mutations so unusual, so far removed from anything in the known human record, that they point toward exactly the kind of divergence you would expect from one of these ghost populations. A lineage that split from the main trunk of human evolution, not thousands of years ago, but hundreds of thousands of years ago. A branch that developed in relative isolation, accumulating its own unique genetic changes over an almost incomprehensible span of time, before somehow intersecting with the royal burial traditions of a civilization that we do know and can study and have studied for generations. How do you get the remains of such a being inside a royal tomb? That is the question that generates the most heat, the most speculation, the most divergent theories, among everyone who has taken this discovery seriously. And there are several possible answers. None of them simple, all of them fascinating. The first possibility is interbreeding. We already know this happened between modern humans and Neanderthals. We already know it happened between modern humans and Denisovans. The evidence is in our own DNA. Every person alive today with ancestry from outside sub-Saharan Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal genetic material, typically somewhere between 1 and 4%. Populations in parts of East Asia. Southeast Asia and the Pacific carry an additional percentage of Denisovan DNA. These are not traces of contamination or laboratory error. They are the permanent record of ancient encounters, written into the human genome and passed down through every generation since. If interbreeding with known archaic human populations left a measurable mark in our DNA, then interbreeding with an unknown population, one of the ghost lineages that geneticists have been hunting for decades, would do exactly the same. And if the individual buried in that royal tomb was the product of such interbreeding, or even a more direct descendant of such a lineage, then the unusual DNA we found there is not mysterious at all. It is exactly what we should expect to find if we are ever going to find these ghost populations at all. The second possibility is more historically specific, and in some ways more intriguing. Royal bloodlines across many ancient cultures were maintained with extraordinary deliberateness. The people who sat at the top of ancient hierarchies, pharaohs, kings, emperors, high priests, were not simply the most powerful individuals of their time. They were the custodians of a lineage, a family line that was protected, preserved, and in many cases deliberately kept separate from the general population. In Egypt, this manifested as the practice of sibling marriage among royalty, a tradition that strikes modern observers as deeply disturbing, but served a specific dynastic purpose. In other cultures, it took different forms, but the underlying logic was the same. The royal bloodline was something apart, something that had to be maintained in its original form. What if that original form was, in some cultures, genuinely different from the population around it? What if the founding figure of a royal dynasty, the individual whose descendants became kings and queens, carried a genetic heritage that was itself archaic, divergent, connected to one of those ghost populations? That would mean that with every generation of careful, deliberate inbreeding, that unusual genetic signature would not dilute and disappear as it might in a general population. It would be concentrated, preserved, passed down, and when we eventually found the bones of someone deep in that royal lineage and ran their DNA, we would see exactly what the researchers saw: mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal in the modern record. The third possibility is the one that the more cautious voices in the scientific community prefer, because it requires the fewest extraordinary assumptions. That possibility is simply that we have not yet found enough ancient DNA. The database of ancient human genomes is growing rapidly, but it is still vanishingly small compared to the total number of human beings who have ever lived. When geneticists say that a particular set of mutations has never been seen before, what they mean is that it has never been seen in the samples they have managed to collect and analyze so far. The absence of a match in the current database is not proof that no match exists. It is proof only that if a match exists, it has not yet been found. As more ancient remains are analyzed, as the database grows, as techniques improve and more sites are excavated and more samples are taken, it is entirely possible that this anomalous genetic signature will eventually find its home somewhere in the expanding map of human evolutionary history, not as the remnant of an alien civilization, not as proof of a secret history, but as another piece in the vast and complicated puzzle of who we are and where we came from. That is the mainstream path: careful, rigorous, genuinely fascinating, and far from finished. But now follow the other path for a moment, not because it represents scientific consensus, it does not, but because the questions it raises deserve to be heard, if only because they capture something real about the limits of what we currently know. There are researchers outside the mainstream academic structure who have been pointing at exactly this kind of genetic anomaly for years, not in the context of Denisovans or ghost populations, but in the context of something older and stranger. They point to sites like Parasas in Peru, where a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello made one of the most unsettling discoveries of the 20th century back in 1928. In the desert, he found a massive graveyard. And in that graveyard, he found skulls, more than 300 of them. And these skulls were not like normal human skulls. They were elongated to a degree that went far beyond anything that could be explained by the practice of head binding, the ancient custom of wrapping an infant's skull to reshape it, gradually over time. Normal head binding changes the shape of the skull. It does not change its volume. The Paracas skulls had cranial volumes significantly larger than ordinary human skulls, in some cases up to 25% larger and up to 60% heavier. That is not a cosmetic difference. That is a structural difference, a fundamental difference in the size and organization of the brain case itself. When samples from these skulls were sent for DNA analysis, hair, teeth, skin, fragments of bone, the results were reported to show mitochondrial DNA with mutations that were, again, unknown in any human, primate, or animal in the existing scientific record. The researcher who first reported these findings wrote that the mutations suggested, if they held up, that the researchers were dealing with a new human-like creature, very distant from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. He wrote that he was not sure the being would even fit into the known evolutionary tree. Strong words, extraordinary words, and words that were met, predictably, with enormous skepticism from mainstream scientists who demanded peer-reviewed publication, transparent methodology, and rigorous contamination controls before any such conclusion could be drawn. That peer-reviewed publication never came. The methodology remained opaque. The contamination controls were questioned. And later, more carefully conducted tests on different Paracas skull samples came back with results that were, if no less surprising, at least more conventionally explicable. Those later results showed haplogroups associated with European and Middle Eastern ancestry, genetic signatures belonging to populations that, according to the conventional history of human migration, should not have been present in South America at the time these individuals were buried. That finding is significant in its own right. It suggests that the peopling of the Americas was more complex and more globally connected than the standard model allows, but it does not require a new species. It requires only a broader understanding of ancient human movement and contact. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in the same place that the best science always leaves us, somewhere between what we know and what we don't, straining toward clarity, knowing that clarity itself is always provisional, always subject to revision when the next bone is found, when the next sequence is run, when the next database entry is added, and the picture shifts again. What we know is this: the human family tree is not a tree. It was never a tree. It is a thicket, dense and tangled, full of branches that crossed and merged and grew back together in ways that defy the clean diagrams in the textbooks. We know that at least two other human species, Neanderthals and Denisovans, lived alongside our ancestors and interbred with them, leaving genetic traces that persist in living human populations today. We know that the genetic evidence points to the existence of additional archaic populations, the ghost lineages, that contributed DNA to our ancestors, but have never been identified in the fossil record. We know that ancient royal bloodlines were often carefully maintained in ways that could, in principle, preserve unusual genetic signatures across many generations. And we know that the database of ancient human DNA is still in its early stages, still growing, still capable of overturning assumptions that seemed settled just years before. What we do not know is what exactly was buried in that royal tomb. We do not know, with certainty, which branch of the human family tree that individual belonged to. We do not know whether the anomalous DNA represents a ghost population finally found, a deeply isolated lineage preserved in a royal bloodline, or simply a gap in our current knowledge that a future discovery will quietly fill. We do not know, and that not knowing is not a failure. It is the engine of science. It is the thing that keeps researchers in the field, that keeps laboratories running, that keeps the questions alive long after the easy answers have been exhausted. The discovery of the Dragon Man skull in China brought this into sharper focus than almost anything that came before it. A worker found it in 1933, building a bridge over the Songhua River. He hid it at the bottom of a well for decades, and it only came to scientific attention in 2018. When researchers finally got hold of it and began the painstaking process of extracting genetic material, they ran into every obstacle that ancient DNA work routinely presents. The bones gave up nothing. The teeth gave up nothing. It was only when researchers turned to the dental calculus, the hardened plaque on the remaining tooth, that they finally found what they were looking for. Mitochondrial DNA, fragmentary, incomplete, but readable. And when they read it, they found that this massive skull, with its enormous brow ridges and its vast cranial capacity and its face that looked like nothing anyone had ever put a name to, belonged to the Denisovans, the species that had previously been nothing more than a ghost in the genome, a whisper in the DNA of living East Asians and Pacific Islanders, suddenly had a face, suddenly had a skull, suddenly had a physical presence in the fossil record that could be studied, compared, measured, and understood. That is what genuine scientific discovery looks like. Not a clean answer delivered in a single moment, but a slow accumulation of evidence, each piece falling into place over years and decades, each new technique. Unlocking something that previous techniques could not reach, each question answered, generating 3 new questions that will keep the next generation of researchers busy for another decade. The ancient Egyptian Genome Project tells the same kind of story from a different angle. Inside a tomb cut into the limestone hills of the Nuyat necropolis, archaeologists found a ceramic pot. Curled inside was a skeleton from the Old Kingdom, buried roughly 4,500 years ago. Inside one of that man's teeth, sealed away from the degrading effects of time and environment, was a genetic time capsule. When scientists extracted and sequenced it, they found that 80% of his DNA traced back to Neolithic North African populations, and 20% traced back to groups in West Asia, in Anatolia, in the Levant. He was not one thing. He was a mixture, the product of ancient population movements and contacts that the conventional historical record had only hinted at. His face was reconstructed from a 3-dimensional scan of his skull, and when people looked at that reconstruction, they were looking at the face of a man who had been dead for 4.5 millennia, but whose story, written in his own DNA, had survived intact. These are the stories that the Earth keeps offering up, piece by piece, tomb by tomb. Stories of a human past so complex, so interconnected, so full of meetings and migrations and mixings, that our maps of it are perpetually out of date, perpetually in need of revision. The anomalous DNA found in that ancient royal burial is one more piece in that story. It may turn out to be the piece that finally names one of the ghost populations. It may turn out to be evidence of interbreeding that preserved an archaic lineage inside a royal bloodline across hundreds of generations. It may turn out to be the first hard data point that pulls one of science's most persistent mysteries out of the realm of speculation and into the realm of fact. Or it may turn out to be something else entirely, something that requires a framework we do not yet have, a question whose answer demands concepts and categories that human science has not yet developed because the thing it describes has not yet been fully imagined. That sounds extreme. It sounds like the beginning of a very different kind of story, one with less rigorous standards of evidence. But the history of science is full of moments when the data arrived before the theory, when researchers found something that made no sense within the current understanding and had to sit with that incomprehension for years or decades until the understanding finally caught up. The discovery of DNA itself was that kind of moment. The discovery of Denisovans was that kind of moment. Every genuine revolution in our understanding of human origins has begun with a result that did not fit, a sequence that had no match, a bone that belonged to nobody, until suddenly it did. When the results came back from that royal tomb, when the screens in the laboratory lit up with a genetic profile that matched nothing in the database, when the scientists ran the test again and got the same answer and called in their colleagues and got the same answer again, what they were experiencing was not the end of a mystery. They were experiencing the beginning of one. And beginnings, in science as in everything else, are not moments of failure. They are moments of extraordinary, terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Think about what it means to hold a bone that is thousands of years old and know that the story it carries has never been told before. Every ancient burial is a message sent forward through time by people who had no idea who would eventually receive it. They buried there, dead with care, with ceremony, with offerings and rituals that reflected their deepest beliefs about what death meant and what came after. They did not know that one day machines would exist that could read the chemistry of a tooth and reconstruct the face of the person it once belonged to. They did not know that the microscopic instructions encoded inside their cells would survive the collapse of their civilization, the erosion of their monuments, the silence of their language. They only knew that this person mattered, that this life deserved to be honored. And in a way they could never have anticipated, that memory endured. The tomb was sealed for thousands of years. The bones kept their secret for all that time. Now the secret is out, the work is underway, and somewhere in a laboratory, or in a field, or in the careful analysis of a sequence that nobody has run yet, the answer is waiting, patient as the dead, old as the earth itself, and closer with every passing year to finally being found.